Welcome. This is the second or third presentation for current issues, and I've got 10 slides that I just want to go through very quickly about three topics. So hopefully these will sort of help give you a little bit of a planner for the work you're going to produce. So let me just introduce the topic. We're working towards P2 and M2, which is describe the influence of media on a selected sport in the UK, and we're explaining the influence of the media on a selected sport in the UK. Yesterday we looked at television, so hopefully you got some sort of stats about how television is so huge, and the size of the broadcasting deals, and maybe the way that's changed the game. So today I'm focusing on three things, which is related to the press. So this is the print news, which when this qualification was written was probably the major sort of alternative source of information. And when your qualification was written, there wasn't so much in terms of the social media. Your qualifications come from I don't know, maybe sort of 7-8 years ago. And possibly the influence of things like sort of Twitter, Instagram accounts, and what have you wasn't quite so great. So some of the examples I'll give might be a little bit older, but I think some of the concepts still hold true. So we're going to look at this concept of gender imbalance. We're going to look at this concept of sensationalism, and we're going to look at this idea of jingoism. So they're quite interesting things. Again, this sort of comes from the branch of sports science, which you call the sociology of sport, which I think is a really interesting field of study. Certainly, when I was at university, it was something that I really got into, possibly more than the sort of anatomy physiology at that time. I think it's a really fascinating subject. So I'm kind of we're kind of again just scratching the surface of these topics and trying to give you some ideas about thinking of the sort of wider picture of sports science. So let's crack on. So we're going to first enter this concept of gender imbalance. I'm just going to present Gigi for the day. She's grown. Look at her. There she goes. So she's sort of I'm sort of sitting quite awkwardly. So this concept of gender imbalance, we're looking at it from a press perspective. So one thing that would be quite interesting for you to do is to just follow the link or log on to the BBC Twitter account, and just scroll down maybe sort of 10, 20 stories, and just have a look at see how many of them contain women. I did it earlier, and I was quite sort of shocked. I think there was one of the Williams sisters knocking about in there, but there was nothing sort of pressing for them. There was a number of stories about men, just their sort of day-to-day lives that were fairly inconsequential. But the percentage of coverage of female sports is so wildly different. Another thing might be useful to actually just look at, a newspaper. So if you look at the Guardian website, I've got a link there. Fairly kind of liberal, balanced newspaper. And again, I went looking for articles that sort of, contained female sports people. And there was one, and it was about someone being injured, and the rest were just all male dominated. So it was quite interesting to see that. So the first thing that you can look at is really sort of consider the difference in the amount of coverage. I've linked quite an interesting consideration here, is that it's so sort of ingrained in the press to consider men's sport much more, but there's parts of the world, we're coming from a football perspective, so I think it's in some ways quite natural that you've got if you've got men's teams have so much more coverage, so much more commercial clout behind them. But even in America, there's sort of gender imbalances which kind of don't make sense. So if you look at American international football, the women's team is far more successful. They won the World Cup. Commercially, they're huge. They're huge news. far more than the men's team. You know, in America, the people don't really know the men's team to any great extent, but they do know the women's team. Yet, after the World Cup, the women's team got paid substantially less than the men's team. So some of the sort of arguments about sort of gender imbalance in terms of pay don't really stack up. Some of the interesting things I've written here. So there's I've linked here to a little site that you might want to look at just for getting some background information on this concept of gender imbalance. And it notes here that actually out of 3 months sports coverage of the BBC Facebook page, only just over 5% of posts covered women's sport at all. And so there's a nice sort of link in there to sort of that takes that further on. So number one, the sort of gender imbalance comes from just the lack of coverage of women's sport. A bit of it possibly comes from the lack of female journalists. So I've linked here a study by Deirdre O'Neill, I should have put a capital letter in there, and Suzanne Frank. So they studied, this was done in, it was across a long period of time. But part of their study, they looked at over 10,000 articles, trying to concentrate on a period immediately before 2012 Olympics and immediately after, but also looking 10 years prior to that. They found that even immediately after the Olympics, that all the press sort of byline headlines, roughly 3% of them involve women's sport. So it's an incredible. Sorry, this is 3% of the actual authors, I should say. So the articles written, there was fewer than 3%, or sorry, around 3% were actually written by women. So the actual number of female journalists is really low, and this might be because sports desks in newspapers are particularly sexist places. It might be because a lot of the sports that get most coverage are sort of quite male dominated. But it is an interesting stat to show that the lack of women's involvement in press journalism. Number two is the way that women are portrayed, and I think there's an interesting few points here. That on the top right here, I've got a tennis player who's retired now. She's Anna Kournikova. For a long period, she was the best paid female athlete in the world, and she never won a major. She sort of burst onto the scene as quite a young athlete. I think she retired when she was about 21, 22. But people were just fascinated by her because she's sort of blonde and attractive, and she had quite a sort of a mysterious social life. But her press coverage was out of control. You know, she's the only person for a while that could get on the back page of a newspaper. You know, she was the coverage of her was huge, but it was really nothing to do with her sporting talent or her skill or any sort of drama around her playing. A lot of it was about her look. So one of the ideas about this gender imbalance is the sort of way that the press will focus on particularly things like looks, particularly what women are wearing. Also, you tend to get more coverage about what they do outside of their life, their kids, and what have you. Things that wouldn't be covered in men's sport. On the bottom right, I've just got a little stat showing a 2014. You can bring this stat into your work. A 2014 report from Oxford University on behalf of the Journal of Public Health reported that media sports coverage for women is between 1% and 6%. So just in terms of total coverage, tiny amount. I've got on the bottom there, you can get a point if you can guess who that is. This is Rebecca Vardy, who is a celebrity in her own right, possibly more than the players that are pictured above her. So there is a huge sort of amount of press coverage around footballers' wives, which is bizarre. These are people who are married to the footballers. Rebecca Vardy, as far as I'm aware, didn't really have a great talent before she became a footballer's wife. And for a lot of the press, stories about them are sort of far more read and far more noted than actually press reports about female athletes. So it's quite an interesting sort of position that they find themselves in. But it's also one of the things that it kind of reinforces the sort of male ideal of the player and the almost kind of that masculine ideal. At the top, I've got the women's football team at the most recent World Cup where they did particularly well, and I think what's been interesting is the way that they're described and the way that they're reported is it's almost as if they're kind of disruptors. If they come out of nowhere, they're kind of exploded and showing the men up by performing well. And I think what's interesting is actually the sort of the portrayal of them often sort of it's almost kind of as if it's just been invented, women's football, and actually ignores the sort of behind the scenes years of that it's actually been going. So I think all of these pictures I've got up here are quite sort of interesting things for you to consider in your assignments about one, do we see an imbalance in the type of stories and the type of coverage that women get? We definitely see an imbalance in the amount of coverage. We see a focus on the wives, possibly more than sort of female players, which is bizarre. But also when reporting about the women's football team, they're often kind of reported almost in comparison to the men about how they perform, how they play, but almost kind of presented as these sort of disruptors, as if they've sort of come out of nowhere and they sort of ignore those years of hard work that people have put in, the sort of day-to-day work that they do. Particularly when the World Cup was a big thing, the Women's World Cup, we saw that there's a relatively large amount of coverage, and you could ask the question, where's it gone now? There's no sort of follow up to it, is there? There's no sort of there's not quite the same period of build up to that World Cup, sort of months of speculation, and then there's not that period the other side. So on each of these topics, I've tried to give you a little planner, things that you might like to discuss in your assignments. This one I've just sort of said to begin with, just explain that there is a male dominance in sports reporting. This has always been the case. It's a very male-orientated world. This could be because the most popular sports are very male-dominated, but also there might be an element of sexism within the print industry. Certainly when you look at the male versus female percentages in standard journalism, I think it's around something like 40% of women, something around that. But if you look at the number of sports reporters who are women, it's far, far lower. I think it's something maybe even lower than 1 in 6. It's very, very low. There is an imbalance generally within sport. I've got a stat there that of the highest 100 paid sports stars, 1 is a woman. You can research who that is. Explain also that the tradition. Well, I think it's important to explain that traditionally women have suffered both from the amount and the type of coverage. So there's some nice statistics about the amount of coverage versus women. But I think the 5 points I've got here are quite nice for you to build in, and there's a little bit of reading at the bottom that you can follow to just sort of give yourself a little bit more background. So number one, I think often the sort of the performance is often slightly trivialized in terms of skills, effort, endeavor. Maybe the sort of level that of critique of performances is slightly different between men and women. So you might sort of, like with the lionesses, they're all sort of bright, brave. They're sort of, they're to a certain extent, it was a lot about effort and performance, and maybe the skill level wasn't quite so praised as perhaps the men's team might be. So we slightly sort of trivialize it in terms of sort of emphasizing things like effort, endeavour, what have you, but possibly a different emphasis on the sort of spectacular nature of performance, the skills that have been demonstrated. So there's a difference in the way that things are reported. We tend to see a more of a sort of sexualized type of reporting in many sports, particularly things like tennis, where the clothing is always sort of emphasized and considered. There's often a focus on people's home lives, how they balance their sports performance with their home life and what have you, which you don't get that same level of critique with the men's games. We also see a sort of large number of stories about footballers' wives, which reinforces that ideal of the dominant male masculinity, and it kind of detract. You don't get that same focus with the women's game. You don't have the sort of footballers' husbands and the sort of interest in how they look and what they're wearing to go and watch their wives. So there's some sort of a strange kind of imbalance there. And I finally got that idea about the success being presented as kind of disrupting, as if the team had sort of come out of nowhere, and ignoring maybe the sort of longer term development and longer term sort of struggle and history of the game. And there is a long history of women's football. So a couple more. There's only 3 slides. So this is about the concept of sensationalism. So I've kind of got on the top right hand side, I've got a little, I've nicked it off Wikipedia about the definition of sensation, what it means to people. So you see it, especially in this kind of print journalism, the presentation of stories in a way that is intended to provoke public interest or excitement at the expense of accuracy. So I've got a few examples here. I'll go around. Let's have a look at from the left. So, what might be a good bit of homework for you is to watch the Paul Gascoigne documentary, and I think it's on Amazon or Netflix or and he's quite interesting because he was of an era where an interesting player, and it was noted that stories about him sold newspapers. So there, rather than just sort of focusing solely on his playing skills, if you're going to do that, you might you have to wait every couple of weeks, particularly for him who's got injured quite a lot. So it was kind of noted that actually he had an interesting home life. He had an interesting personal life. People wanted stories about him. If he drove a new car or got up to something silly, that would sell even more newspapers than talk about his performance in a match. So sensationalizing these home stories, these background stories, actually created more interest in the paper. So lots of sensationalized stories, particularly about players' kind of backgrounds, creates interest, and it sells newspapers. So here was his. So the one on the left-hand side is from an incident just prior to the European Championships in '96, I think it was. So a long time ago for you, and so this is a time when possibly the England team were being criticised quite heavily, and they went out on a night out and got absolutely hammered. They sat there was something in the bar where you could sit back in a dentist chair, and the barman would pour 2 drinks into your mouth. And at the time, Paul Gascoigne was coming in for a lot of criticism for not being kind of physically prepared. So there was this article, and then in a match against Scotland, Paul Gascoigne scored a stunning goal. You can look it up on YouTube if you haven't seen it. And as part of the celebration, they'd all pre-arranged to kind of replicate that dentist chair. So it's kind of a nice sort of story to see it kind of come full circle. But that press sensationalism, that sort of ramping up excitement, is really their way of generating interest, generating excitement, and selling newspapers. I've got some other examples here. Sometimes the headlines can be just quite fun. So I've got one here: Super Cali go ballistic, Celtic are atrocious. This was Celtic being beaten. I can't remember how many it was, maybe 4. Look it up. They got beaten by Caledonian Thistle, and so they came up with this wonderful headline. They can be quite sort of xenophobic here. We've got Thierry Henry handling in a ball against the Irish. And they've come up with quite a xenophobic headline here: the $1 billion or pound hand of frog. So sort of almost being quite sort of unpleasant towards him. And then on the right hand side, I've got this sort of sensationalism about Raheem Sterling. Sometimes the press likes to almost kind of pick on a player and create a series of articles that kind of build up that story about a particular player. And that seemed to happen a couple of years ago with Raheem Sterling particularly. I don't think he'd done anything particularly awful either. And so he was sort of being sort of pilloried in the press. And a number of players came out in his defence to suggest that, maybe it was a little bit racist, perhaps the way that he was being covered. But essentially, the press creates this sensationalism in order to generate interest and in order to generate either newspaper sales or interest for their advertisers. So as a planner, I just kind of put it together. So one thing that's interesting is how linked the press is. The press and TV are linked. So Rupert Murdoch owns the Sun and the Times. So the Sun is a tabloid newspaper. The Times is supposedly a broadsheet, and Sky is the sort of main provider of football on telly. So if you can create interest from all those avenues, you can create that sort of excitement, you can create sales, and advertisers are going to be pleased. In your essay, explain that creating sensationalism creates interest, it sells newspapers. And you can look at actually how newspapers might have done almost kind of generated the interest themselves. So things like entrapment is where the newspaper almost kind of sets up situations for players or managers to fail. I've linked on here to Sam Allardyce, who was sort of trapped by a kind of fake, I don't know if it was one of these fake shakes, but he was kind of presented this sort of opportunity, and he was just talking, but a lot of what he was saying was being secretly recorded, and ultimately at the end of it, he sort of made a few boastful claims, and he lost his job. And so it's almost like the sensationalism of the press is they realise that they can create this interest, they can create this excitement, so they almost kind of go out of their way to sort of manufacture these incidents. They can create a narrative, i.e. a longer term story that allows the press to create a series of related articles to hook readers in. So you might see one article on Raheem Sterling, for example, about him getting a tattoo. You might see another one the next day. He might have crashed his car whilst he was going a bit too quick. They create this sort of pattern, this sort of group of articles together. That sort of means that if you've read one on one person, you might go and read the next one. So they almost kind of create this sort of narrative, this series of stories to kind of hook readers in, to create that kind of repeat business. So headlines are what sell papers. So if they can create sensational headlines, they'll sell them. So in your article, in your sort of essay, try and give some examples. Just have a look through, the Sun, see what's in their sports pages. Maybe go back a few years around World Cup times and the like. See if you can come up with some really sort of exaggerated, sensationalist headlines. Try and surprise me. So the last bits we come to is this concept of jingoism. So again, I've got a couple of definitions here. So jingoism is this extreme patriotism, especially in the form of aggressive or warlike foreign policy. So within the press, what you're doing is it's creating this kind of extreme patriotism. It's often a little bit warlike in its approach. So if you think about when World Cups happen, all these sort of St. George's flags kind of covering people's cars, and people sort of sticking up these flagpoles in their garden. That's quite sort of similar to a kind of a wartime feel, isn't it? That sort of extreme sort of coverage of this flag. It kind of goes beyond normal supporting in a way, doesn't it? On the right hand side, I've got an example of possibly the kind of most extreme manifestation of this. This was from 1996 when England were due to meet the Germans. So a couple of years prior, they'd been knocked out on penalties by the Germans, and sort of a lot of people were still quite sort of upset about the way it happened and sort of felt quite aggrieved. And so the press kind of ramp up this jingoism. They create this sort of them and us, almost kind of warlike sort of battle. And as it ramps up again, it becomes a sort of